2 grizzly bear cubs freezing starving, and tied to a tree with wire left by poachers in the middle of the Montana wilderness. No food, no shelter, and as night fell the howls of a wolf pack echoed through the trees. Everyone thought they were already dead, but when a local man and his daughter took a different trail that morning, what they discovered changed everything, and what happened next will break your heart. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. That helps us bring you more real, unforgettable stories of courage, connection, and the quiet heroes of the wild. The wind howled through the Bitterroot Range like a morning song. Snow clung to the limbs of the pines and coated the forest floor in a thick, silent sheet. No footsteps, no tire tracks, just untouched wilderness, the kind that didn't forgive mistakes, but they're barely visible behind a fallen cedar were the shapes, 2 small bodies motionless tied to a tree. The cubs were no more than 6 months old, fur matted with mud and dried blood. One had wire wrapped around its midsection, tight and cruel, biting deep into the skin. The other was tangled by the front paws, hanging awkwardly against the bark, like someone had tried to string it up. Like bait, they didn't move. Their eyes were dull, but they were alive. Eli Madsen didn't know what he'd find that morning when he took his usual detour along Grizzly Hollow. His daughter, June 13, years old, and too brave for her own good, was hiking beside him with a small pack of supplies. They had been tracking elk earlier. It was just something they did to feel close to nature after losing Eli's wife 2 winters ago. But this wasn't nature, this was cruelty. June saw them first. Dad, Eli turned, his breath freezing midair. His heart stopped. Are those? He didn't finish the sentence. He was already running when he reached the tree. The smell hit him first. Infection, blood, fear. The cubs didn't growl, didn't try to run. They didn't have the strength. June stood back, eyes wide, one hand over her mouth. Who would do this? She whispered. Eli didn't answer. He pulled his multi-tool from his coat and dropped to his knees. The wire was tight, too tight. The cub whimpered, a tiny broken sound that didn't belong in the world. Eli said gently, it's okay, little one, I got you. The wind picked up again, and in it a sound low, far, a howl. June looked up, then another closer. I think there's a pack nearby, she said. Eli didn't look up. His hands worked fast. Then we don't have time. He cut the wire on the first cub. Blood flowed immediately, but the bear slumped into the snow, free. The second cub was harder. The wire had twisted around the front legs like someone had intentionally looped it to hang the animal vertically. It wasn't just trapping, it was punishment. Eli's jaw clenched. He cut the last loop and cradled the cub as it fell into his arms, tiny, trembling, and still breathing. We have to carry them out, June said. Eli nodded. He wrapped one in his coat. June took the other, holding it close like a sleeping child, and the howls came again, this time too close. The forest no longer felt still. It moved not in the branches or the wind, but somewhere deeper beneath the silence around them. Eli could feel it in his chest. The wolves weren't hunting elk now. They had picked up something easier, something slower. June's arms shook beneath the weight of the cub, but she didn't complain. She kept her chin tucked against the little bear's head, whispering things he couldn't understand, soft, steady, like lullabies. Eli had wrapped the other cub in his flannel coat. It stirred once, let out a weak sound, then went limp again. Still alive, but fading. Snow began falling harder, thick flakes cutting sideways through the pines. Their trail, already shallow, was disappearing fast, and the howls now, they were closer, maybe 200. Why, maybe less. We won't outrun them, June said. Eli looked behind them, nothing but white and trees. We don't have to outrun them, he replied. We just have to not Stop. But the cub in his arms had other plans. He let out a sharp cry. The first sound of strength they'd heard then went still too. Still. Eli dropped to one knee behind a boulder, checking the cub's chest. Still breathing. Barely. He looked at June. We have to take a break, just 5 minutes. She hesitated, then nodded. They set the cubs down side by side on Eli's coat. June crouched beside them, shielding their bodies from the wind. Eli stood, scanning the trees, and that's when he saw them. 3 shadows, low, moving with purpose. Wolves, gray and lean, eyes glinting through the white. They hadn't charged. Not yet, but they were circling. Eli stepped in front of June and the cubs. He drew his flare gun, a last resort tool he'd hoped never to use. Only one shot. He raised it high. Bang! Red light exploded over the trees. The wolves paused, startled. One backed away, but only for a second. Then they came forward again. Slower now, more cautious, but hungrier. Suddenly behind them a noise, heavy, rushing, a snowmobile engine. Eli turned to see a small rescue sled bursting through the trees. Headlights piercing the white. A figure in an orange parka waved from the driver's seat. Hey, need help? Eli didn't hesitate. He scooped both cubs up. June grabbed their packs and they ran. The driver's name was Miles, a fire lookout who had seen the flare from his tower. They loaded the cubs into the back of the sled, piled blankets over them, and climbed in as the engine roared and the sled tore through the woods. Eli looked back one last time. The wolves stood at the edge of the trail, watching, not chasing, just waiting. Where'd you find them? Miles shouted over the wind. Tied to a tree. Eli replied like someone wanted them to die slowly. Miles didn't respond. He only pressed harder on the throttle. The ranger station was built for bad weather. Stone walls, steel roof, wood stove, always burning. It was the kind of place that made you feel safe the second the door shut behind you. But that night nothing felt safe, not with those 2 cubs on the table, shaking and silent. Dr. Margaret Price, field vet, mid-50s, sharp-eyed and sharper spoken, didn't waste time. She arrived less than 20 minutes after the call from Miles. Within seconds she had gloves on and a light in her hand, moving around the smaller of the cubs with clinical precision. Eli and June stood back still, soaked in melted snow. Claire, one of the junior rangers, handed them blankets. Margaret worked in silence, cut away the fur near the wire wounds, pressed gently along the limbs, checked the ears, the gums, the pads of their paws. Finally she spoke. They're not just starving, she said. They've been kept. Eli stepped forward. What do you mean, kept? Margaret looked up. These aren't wild wounds. Look here. She pointed to the elder cub's ribs. This pattern, repeated pressure, blunt trauma, could have been caused by a metal pole or wooden staff. Repeated, controlled. June gasped. They were in a cage, she asked. Margaret nodded slowly. Or a pen for weeks at least, maybe months. Silence settled in the room like a weight. Miles ran a hand through his beard. So this wasn't a trap gone wrong? No, Margaret replied. This was intentional, deliberate neglect, possibly poaching. Claire opened a folder on the table. There was a raid last winter up near Flathead. A guy had kept 2 adult grizzlies locked up for almost a year. Said they were part of a private exotic collection. Eli's eyes narrowed. Any chance these cubs were born there? Margaret hesitated. If they were, and the place was shut down, someone took them when the others were rescued. Why would they tie them to a tree? June asked. Margaret's voice softened. Maybe they thought it was more merciful than putting a bullet in them. Eli didn't speak. He sat beside the table, placed one hand near the smaller cub's paw. It flinched barely, then relaxed. I don't care who they belong to, Eli said. They belong here. Now by morning the cubs had eaten small bites, a few laps of water, but they were still alive. June didn't leave their side. She named them Scout for the one who fought the hardest against the wire, and Murphy for the quiet one who never cried. Outside the storm cleared, but inside something else was building. Margaret made a call to wildlife enforcement, and Eli, he made a promise to the cubs, even if they couldn't hear it. You'll never be alone again, not while I'm breathing. Lime by sunrise. The cubs' story had already started to spread. A local news team caught wind of the rescue after a dispatcher overheard the flare call on an open channel. Within hours a camera crew stood just outside the ranger station, bundled in coats, narrating into microphones as snow melted around their boots. The segment aired by noon, and the internet did the rest. 2 grizzly bear cubs, tied, wounded, and left for dead in the Montana wilderness, were rescued yesterday by a local man and his daughter, now recovering at a ranger station near Bitterroot. The cubs are being treated by wildlife professionals. Authorities believe the case may be linked to illegal captivity or poaching. Eli didn't want cameras, but June said something that made him think twice. If people see them, maybe the people who hurt them will be afraid. He nodded and let the crew film Scout and Murphy from a respectful distance. Claire handled the press. Margaret handled the science. Eli stayed quiet, but his silence spoke louder than the broadcast. By dusk the first stranger arrived. He didn't drive in with a film crew or a badge. He came in an old pickup truck, one headlight broken, coat too thin for the cold. Claire spotted him standing by the fence near the generator. "Can I help you, sir?" The man nodded slowly. His eyes were red, not from tears, from exhaustion. "I think I know those cubs." His name was Leon Walsh. He used to work as a farmhand on a remote property near Flathead Lake, the same one from the wildlife raid a year earlier. He'd helped with fencing, didn't ask questions until one day he saw something he couldn't unsee. A cage, a mother bear, 2 newborns beside her. The man who owned the land had them hidden under a tarp, chained, barely breathing. Leon quit the next morning, but he never reported it. He was afraid. When he saw the cubs on the news, something inside him snapped. "I should have done something back then," he told Eli. "Maybe their mom would still be alive." Eli didn't say much, just opened the gate and walked Leon inside, let him see them up close. Scout lifted his head. Murphy didn't, but Leon dropped to his knees beside them, took off his hat and whispered, "I'm sorry." Claire filed an official statement. Leon gave them names, dates, the location of the old property, and wildlife enforcement reopened the case. For the first time in months there were leads. That night June sat beside the cubs, stroking Murphy's "For do you think their mom fought back?" Eli didn't hesitate. "She did." He looked out the window toward the forest. "And now it's our turn." The raid happened before sunrise. 3 trucks, 6 officers, 1 unmarked SUV. Leon had marked the location on a map with shaking hands. A clearing deep off a fire road, no longer on state records. The old cabin was almost invisible under the weight of pine needles and silence. What they found inside stunned even the most seasoned agents. Rusty cages stacked like forgotten drawers, chains, ropes, tools blackened with age and use, bloodstains and bones. Not many, but enough to know this place had been more than a cage. It had been a slaughterhouse in the smallest enclosure, just large enough for one animal to turn. Once an empty chain still hung from the wall. On the floor near the corner a piece of fur lay matted into the dirt. Dark, long. Grizzly back at the station. The cubs hadn't moved in hours. Scout was curled against the heat lamp, his side rising and falling slow but steady. Murphy, however, had started to breathed differently, shorter. Quicker. Margaret noticed it first. She leaned in, pressed her fingers gently against his ribs. Her face changed. Then she said the word no one wanted to hear. Infection. The wire wounds had been worse than they'd thought. Not deep enough to kill immediately, but enough to open doors for everything the wild carries. Bacteria, rot, fever. Murphy's eyes were glassy now. He didn't cry, didn't whimper. He just drifted, unaware of the fight he was losing. June refused to leave his side. Eli stood by the door, jaw tight, knuckles wide around a mug of untouched coffee. We can get antibiotics flown in by morning, Margaret said, but it's a gamble. I'll take it, Eli replied. Instantly, the next hours felt like days. Every breath Murphy took sounded like it could be his last. Scout pressed against him, refusing to move, as if somehow his little body could offer warmth, memory, life. June whispered stories about sunlight and rivers and mama bears who never gave up. Then at 3:12 a.m. Murphy let out a single sound, a grunt, weak, dry, but a sound. He blinked slow, then tucked his nose under Scout's chest and sighed. By morning the fever hadn't broken, but he was still breathing. The antibiotics had arrived by airop, thanks to a wildlife medic who drove through the night. Margaret administered them with hands that didn't shake, but a heart that did. Eli stood outside in the cold and watched the sky grow lighter behind him. Two cubs lay curled together on a pile of old towels and hope in front of him. A justice system was preparing charges, but in his mind only one thing mattered. Stay alive, little ones, just stay. Murphy was still alive by some small miracle, or maybe the warmth of Scout's body beside him. The infection hadn't taken him, not yet, but Margaret was clear. This place was never meant to be a long-term shelter. They need specialized care, a real rehabilitation facility, somewhere with space, staff, resources. She looked at Eli, then at June, then down at the cubs sleeping side by side. They'll be safe, I promise. But safety, Eli knew, didn't always mean love, and that's what these cubs had come to know here, even if only for a few weeks. He stepped outside to think. June followed him, neither spoke for a long time, just stared at the treetops swaying in the wind. Then she said quietly, "They'll forget us, won't they?" Eli looked down at her. "No, I don't think they will." Back inside, Murphy stirred. Scout was licking his brother's ears, grooming him the way cubs did when their mother was too tired to move. It was instinct, but also something more, something learned. June crouched beside them and rested her hand just an inch from Scout's paw. He didn't flinch anymore. He stayed close. That night Margaret made the call. The center in Bozeman had space too. Open pens, heated dens, medical staff. They'd send transport at dawn, but as she hung up the radio, Eli said, "Not yet." Margaret turned. "You want more time?" "I want to give them spring." She paused, then nodded slowly. She knew what it meant. Risk, responsibility, but also something more sacred. Continuity. Letting the cubs stay meant giving them space to heal in their own time, not just their bodies, but their instincts, their wildness. So for the next 8 weeks the ranger station became something no one expected. A nursery, a halfway home, a place where wild and human coexisted, without touching too much, but just enough to remind one another, "I see you, I respect you, and when the time comes I'll let you go." Murphy grew stronger. Scout grew braver. They began to play, to climb, to nap under the pine boards like they were dens made by some long-lost bear mother. From the stories June whispered at night. Eli repaired the back fence, reinforced the door to the feed shed, built a temporary enclosure where the cubs could dig, roam, learn. By mid-March their eyes were different, sharper, not just full of pain and memory, but something more dangerous and beautiful. readiness, and one morning as snow melted. In slow rivulets along the slope, Eli stood by the pen, and Scout looked at him, head tilted slightly, not begging, not afraid, just looking, then turned toward the trees beyond the fence and waited. Spring came in slow this year. The air was warm by day, but the ground still held winter in its bones. Ice clung to the shaded corners of the station. Buds peeked cautiously from the trees, and the cubs, they were different. Now Murphy ran, not limped. Scout climbed higher than anyone thought a bear his age could. They were eating on their own, grooming each other, wrestling, napping with one eye half open, as wild things do when they know nothing is ever fully safe. Again Eli watched them from the porch, each morning, coffee in hand, hat low, heart heavy, not with sadness but something harder to carry. Readiness, because the time had come, and he knew it. Claire had arranged the release site, a wide valley 2 hours east, ringed by ridges thick with trees and flowing water. No roads, no cabins, no people, just wilderness. Perfect. The night before they left, June slept on the floor beside the pen. She whispered stories again, her favorites, the ones about mother bears who survived avalanches, about cubs that crossed rivers to find their way home. She didn't cry, not until Scout came to the edge of the enclosure, pressed his forehead to the chain link, and made a low sound, the same one he used to make when he was too weak to move, a sound that once meant, "Help me." Now it sounded more like I remember. The next morning they didn't load the cubs into cages. They opened the pen door, let them walk out on their own, and they did, slowly, cautiously, sniffing the air like it held both memory and freedom. Eli and June walked behind them through the woods until they reached the valley. It was early. Mist rolled like a quiet river over the grass. The cubs paused at the tree and looked back, not for long, just long enough. Then Scout nudged Murphy's shoulder, and together they vanished. The woods held their silence for a long time. Eli stood there, one hand on June's shoulder. She didn't ask if they'd ever come back, and he didn't offer any false hopes, because they weren't supposed to. Back at the station, the cage stayed open. The towels were washed and folded, the feeding bowls cleaned and shelved, but the space still felt full of fur, of breath, of something not quite gone. Weeks passed. June stopped checking the edge of the forest every day, but Eli still left the gate unlocked, still poured a little water in the bowl on warm nights, still whistled once softly before going inside. And then one dusk in late April, just as the shadows were melting into the trees, he saw them too, shapes on the ridge, still watching. One raised a paw just once, then disappeared into the green. Eli didn't move, didn't wave, just whispered more to the wind than to them, "You're home now, and you always will be. If this story moved you, let it move someone else too. Like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who still believes that even in the coldest forests, compassion can find a way. Because these weren't just bear cubs. They were survivors, because someone stopped, listened, fought, and never walked away.